She was late, rain on her coat, sandwich in hand, and nerves tightening with every red light. Today was the day she'd finally meet her fiancé's father, the man everyone called the reclusive billionaire. But when she saw a shivering stranger on the sidewalk, something in her stopped. She offered him her lunch. He thanked her softly. Minutes later, she walked into a mansion and found the same man sitting at the head of the table. They say cities forget kindness first. Not love, not beauty, kindness. It gets lost somewhere between the crosswalks and the deadlines, where everyone is too busy outrunning silence. That morning, Claire Martin was part of that race. The sky was pale gray, the kind of color that makes promises it never keeps. Her shoes slapped against the pavement as she rushed toward the train station, clutching a paper bag she'd packed the night before. Turkey on rosemary bread, a splash of cranberry jam, one napkin folded with precision. She'd packed it thinking she wouldn't have time to eat later, that nerves would ruin her appetite. But habits are a kind of prayer for people who need control. The bag was still warm from her hands when the rain began, soft at first, then determined. The clouds unzipped themselves, spilling over the skyline. Umbrellas bloomed like hurried excuses, taxis hissed by, and the street took on that wet shimmer that makes every reflection look like a memory trying to come back. Claire pulled her scarf tighter, teeth chattering as she checked her watch. 11 o'clock was approaching. She had 40 minutes to reach the Harland estate, her fiancé's father's estate. The thought made her chest tighten. Ethan had said the man was old money, quiet power, the kind of figure who believed good manners were investments and people should yield interest. "You'll love him," Ethan had promised, grinning as he buttoned his cufflinks that morning. "He's just intense. He notices everything." She'd smiled, though uneasily. She wanted to make a good impression. Not because of the money, but because she loved Ethan, and love always comes with an unspoken clause. "Please let the people who made you approve of me." She rehearsed who made you approve of me. She rehearsed greetings in her mind, adjusting her tone between confident and humble. "Mr. Harland, it's such an honor." Too formal. "Sir, thank you for inviting me." Too meek. She tried to find the balance between belonging and reverence, but the city had other plans. At the corner of Delancey and Fifth, time stopped pretending to be merciful. Traffic stalled. Horns complained. A bus hissed to a halt. And that's when she saw him. He was sitting on the bench beneath the awning, coat soaked through, fingers trembling around an empty paper cup. Not the kind of man who looked dangerous or broken, just misplaced. A life paused between chapters. His shoes were worn down to their honesty, soles peeling like old bark. His hair clung damp to his temples, and yet his posture was straight, proud even, as if dignity refused to abandon him entirely. People streamed by without looking, the way city dwellers do when guilt has become too heavy to carry for strangers. Claire slowed, the rain softening to a rhythm she could hear her own heart inside. She hesitated. Then guilt turned to instinct. "Sir." Her voice was tentative, almost apologetic. He looked up, his eyes gray, clear, and startlingly gentle, met hers with a calm that shouldn't belong to someone freezing on a sidewalk. "Yes, miss. Have you had anything to eat today?" A pause. Then quietly, "Not since yesterday morning." The words pressed against her conscience like stones. She bit her lip, looked down at the paper bag, then back at him. "It's not much, but it's still warm." She extended it. He blinked, the faintest flicker of surprise passing through his features. "You'll need it," he said softly. "I'll be fine." He hesitated again, then took it with a slow nod. "Thank you," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, added, "Kindness never loses its way. Even when people do." For a heartbeat, Claire forgot the rain, the meeting, the importance of arriving on time. The world around them blurred into the sound of passing tires and distant sirens. She smiled. "Take care," she murmured and walked away. She didn't look back, though something inside her wanted to. By the time she reached the gates of the Harland estate, the rain had softened to mist. The mansion rose ahead, tall, symmetrical, heartbreakingly perfect. Its windows caught the weak sunlight like cold eyes, and the driveway stretched in a flawless arc, bordered by manicured hedges that looked too disciplined to be alive. She'd seen the house once before, from photos Ethan showed her, the kind that appear in business magazines and charity galas. But standing there now, she felt small in a way that had nothing to do with size. The air itself seemed to weigh more here. A butler appeared, umbrella in hand. "Miss Martin, welcome." She smiled, grateful but nervous. "Thank you. Mr. Ethan is expecting you in the drawing room." Her reflection glided past mirrors that could remember everyone who'd ever tried to belong here. The walls were heavy with portraits, painted faces of stern men and patient women, all framed in gold and distance. The smell of lemon polish and cedar whispered of order. Ethan appeared at the end of the hallway, bright as ever, the one person who still looked human in all this marble. "Claire," he said, kissing her cheek. "You made it." "Barely," she laughed nervously. "Traffic was impossible." He grinned. "My father's waiting in the dining hall. Don't worry, he's in good spirits today." She smoothed her skirt. "And you're sure I shouldn't have brought anything? You brought yourself." "That's enough." If only that had been true. The butler opened the heavy oak doors to the dining hall. The air shifted, cooler. Far end of the table sat a man in a charcoal suit, posture straight, eyes patient and unreadable. Her heart stumbled. The world contracted. It was him. The man from the bus stop. The one she'd given her lunch to. For a moment sound vanished. Ethan's voice became a distant echo. She saw only that face, the same gentle lines, the same calm, unhurried gaze. Except now he wasn't shivering beneath an awning. He was surrounded by chandeliers, seated at the head of a table that gleamed with crystal and control. "Father," Ethan said proudly, "this is Claire." The older man smiled faintly. "We've met." Claire froze. "We have." "In the city," he said simply, folding his hands. "You gave me your lunch." Ethan blinked, confusion tightening his jaw. "Wait, you were?" The older man's smile deepened. "A test of sorts. For both of you." Her throat went dry. "A test." He gestured for her to sit. "Not of charity," he said softly. "Of instinct." She took her seat, heartbeat thudding in her ears. Ethan sat beside her, bewildered but silent. "I built a fortune on instinct," the man continued, voice like a calm current. "But instincts fade when wealth gets too loud. I wanted to see if my son had chosen someone whose kindness wasn't conditional." Claire swallowed hard. "You pretended to be homeless?" "I didn't pretend," he said quietly. "I remembered." The room held its breath. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Richard Harlan's eyes softened. "There was a time when I was the one asking strangers for mercy. Before the company, before the headlines. I wanted to know if my money had erased that man, or if he could still be recognized by someone who saw past appearances." Claire looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. "I didn't know who you were." That's why it mattered. Between them, his pride quietly folding into humility. "Father, I didn't know." "You weren't supposed to," Richard said. "I wanted to meet her before she met the fortune." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent. The kind of quiet that follows revelation. Finally, Richard smiled. "Now let's eat. I've already had my lunch, thanks to your fiancé." The meal stretched into an afternoon of laughter that felt borrowed from a life simpler than theirs. Richard asked about her teaching job, her students, her parents who still lived in a small coastal town. He listened, not as a man used to obedience, but as one rediscovering the language of warmth. At one point he asked, "Do your students ever learn what you don't mean to teach?" Claire smiled. "Every day. They remind me how to forgive quickly and dream without apology." He nodded. "Then you'll understand what I've forgotten." By the end of lunch, the rain had faded to sunlight. Richard walked them to the front door himself. Before she left, he reached into his pocket and handed her the same paper bag. Unopened, perfectly folded. Inside was a note. "Never underestimate the worth of what you give away." He looked at her with the faintest of smiles. "Keep it," he said. "It's worth more now than when you handed it to me." She didn't know why, but she believed him. As she stepped into the car beside Ethan, the mansion behind her glowed in the last stretch of afternoon light. Beautiful, but no longer intimidating. It was just a house. A grand one, yes. But what filled it today wasn't wealth. It was something rarer, a reminder that compassion still carried currency. Perfect, brother. We'll move into Act 2 rising tension, and make it longer, full cinematic build-up, layered symbolism, emotional escalation and continuity from the first act. Tone reflective, moral, deeply human voices of truth, emotional redemption style. This will feel film scene by scene, quiet tension, moral testing, and foreshadowing the transformation to come. That night, the rain returned softer this time, not as punishment but as memory. Claire lay awake in Ethan's apartment, the city lights blinking against the window like signals from another life. She should have been relieved. The meeting had gone better than she dared hope. Richard Harland, the man everyone described as a recluse, had been gracious, even gentle. Yet beneath that calm she felt something unspoken, a sadness that didn't belong to wealth, but to a man who'd once lived without it. She turned onto her side, eyes tracing the ceiling. Ethan was asleep beside her, one arm over his chest, breathing steady. The rhythm comforted her. Still, a quiet unease grew like fog inside her chest. Something about Richard's eyes wouldn't let her rest. It wasn't their kindness that haunted her, it was the loneliness sitting quietly behind it. Before she drifted off, she replayed his words in her mind. Kindness never loses its way. Even when people do. The next morning, the city gleamed, washed clean by rain but carrying its usual exhaustion. Ethan left early for the firm. Claire called in a personal day, something she rarely did, and decided to walk to clear her head. The streets were bright, but she felt a strange pull toward the part of town where she'd met him. The bus stop was empty now, the bench wet with dew. A man selling newspapers nearby nodded to her. "You're early for the downtown bus," he said. She smiled faintly. "Not waiting for the bus." He studied her for a moment, then said, "You're the teacher, aren't you? The one who gave that gentleman your lunch." Her pulse quickened. "You saw that?" He nodded, grinning. "Hard to forget. Not many stop these days. Most just walk faster." She hesitated. "Do you see him often?" The man folded a paper neatly. "Every week. Always the same. Always polite. Bought a paper sometimes just to ask about the world. Said he liked to read what people were arguing about." Claire smiled at that. "He doesn't seem like a man who argues." The vendor shrugged. Maybe that's why he listened. Something in that line stayed with her. Maybe Richard Harland hadn't been pretending after all. Maybe he had been listening, not to words but to how the world treated silence. Later that week, Ethan brought her back to the mansion for dinner. The invitation had come through the housekeeper, written on cream paper in careful cursive. Dinner at 7. No occasion. Bring the teacher's laughter. Claire smiled when she read it. Richard had a way of writing like a man who'd never forgotten sincerity. The drive there was quiet. Ethan was distracted, checking his phone between red lights. "He's different lately," he muttered. "Happier, maybe? He keeps asking about you." She glanced at him. "Is that a bad thing?" "No. Just new. My father doesn't usually attach." That word caught her, attach. How strange that people who had everything built walls instead of homes. The mansion at night was a different creature. Lamps burned low in the hallways, paintings watched in silence, and somewhere deep inside, a clock ticked like a heartbeat remembering its job. Richard greeted them personally again, his cane resting lightly against the doorway. He looked stronger somehow, or perhaps just more alive. "Claire," he said warmly, "I was hoping you'd come." She smiled. "You invited me." It seemed rude to refuse. "Good," he said. "We'll eat in the conservatory tonight. The walls there don't eavesdrop." Ethan chuckled. "Dad." But Richard only smiled. The conservatory was a world of glass and green. Ferns curled in corners, orchids glowed pale under the lights, and rain pressed gentle fingers against the panes. Dinner waited full, almost humble. "Your father cooks?" Claire asked, surprised. "Tonight, yes," Richard replied. "I find kitchens tell truths that boardrooms avoid." As they ate, conversation flowed easily. Richard spoke not of markets or mergers but of people, the gardeners who'd worked here for decades, the chef who'd once cooked for his late wife, the janitor who wrote poetry no one had ever read. Ethan listened politely but with a distance Claire couldn't miss. When dessert arrived, lemon custard and black tea, Richard turned to her and said, "Claire, do you ever wonder why people fear simplicity?" She blinked. "Because it can't be controlled, maybe." He nodded, pleased. "Exactly. Money buys layers. Complication. But kindness." He paused, stirring his tea. "Kindness strips us bare. It leaves us seen." Ethan sighed softly. "You've been reading too much philosophy again." Richard smiled. Or not enough life. The tension was small, polite, but it lingered. Claire could feel the weight of years in their dynamic, the quiet dissonance between admiration and resentment. When the meal ended, Richard asked her to stay a moment. "Walk with me if you don't mind." Ethan checked his phone. "I've got a quick call anyway." So they walked through corridors lined with art, through a library that smelled like cedar and forgotten laughter. He stopped before a photograph framed in gold. A young woman with wind in her hair, smiling as though the camera had told her a secret. "My wife," Richard said quietly. "She died 30 years ago." Claire studied the photo. "She looks kind." She was. Too kind, maybe. She believed goodness was its own reward. And wasn't it? Richard hesitated. Sometimes. Until it wasn't. She turned to him. "You mean until money made it harder?" He met her gaze, and for a brief second the facade cracked. "I built this empire. If I made the world obey, grief would stay quiet." Claire listened, heart heavy. "But grief doesn't obey, does it?" "No," he said softly. "It only changes form." They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the rain against the glass ceiling. Finally he said, "Do you know why I was at that bus stop?" She shook her head. "Because I wanted to remember what hunger felt like. Not for food, for humanity. I sat there to see if anyone would notice. Most didn't. You did." Her throat tightened. "I didn't do anything special." He smiled sadly. "That's what makes it special." In the days that followed, something subtle began to shift. Richard called Ethan more often, asked questions about his work, invited him to lunch instead of waiting for holidays. Claire noticed the way Ethan softened slightly, the stiffness in his shoulders easing, his laughter returning, if only in small doses. Yet behind the warmth, another current moved, quieter, darker. Richard began spending time downtown again, alone. His driver mentioned it to Ethan in passing. "He says he likes the noise," the man said. Ethan frowned. "He's not meeting someone, is he?" "Not that I've seen. Just sits on that bench." "The same one." Claire's heart jolted. That weekend, she found herself at the bus stop once more, drawn by something she couldn't explain. And there he was, the billionaire among buses, coat collar turned up, reading a newspaper as if it were scripture. She sat beside him without a word. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, not looking up. "I wanted to see what you see." He smiled faintly. "Mostly people pretending they don't." They sat in companionable silence for a while. The city hummed. Pigeons gathered, and a woman with a stroller passed, glancing at them with polite indifference. Finally, he folded the paper and turned to her. "You reminded me that wealth is only useful when it circulates like blood. When it stops moving, it kills whatever it built." Claire looked at him, seeing not a billionaire, but a man still wrestling with the cost of survival. "Maybe kindness circulates too," she said softly. "You gave it back to me, even if you don't realize it." He smiled, eyes glinting with quiet gratitude. "You're right. But it's not done moving yet." That night, a storm broke over the city, thunder rolling through glass towers, lightning sketching ghosts across the sky. And somewhere in the dark, a decision formed, one that would test everything they thought they knew about generosity, pride, and what it truly means to give. For kindness, once set in motion, doesn't stop at a sandwich. It travels through lives, rewriting legacies, until even those who've forgotten how to feel must face the truth of what it costs to remember. Morning arrived with sirens pretending to be wind. Phones lit up before kettles warmed. Headlines outran breakfast. The city, with its talent for spectacle, had found a new center of gravity, a photograph taken in the rain. A grainy frame of a woman handing a paper bag to a man on a bench, a caption that did not ask permission before it decided the story. Teacher feeds vagrant. Vagrant is billionaire Richard Harland. The image jumped from one screen to 1,000. It learned how to talk without context. Comment sections braided empathy with scorn until they were indistinguishable. Some called it a stunt. Some called it saintly. Many called it proof that the rich will dress as poor to see if the world is still worth buying. By noon, the markets heard the noise and translated it the only way they know how, in points falling and rising like anxious breaths. Harland stock dipped, then crawled, then steadied with the kind of nervous grace that money performs when it realizes it can be injured by rumor. In Ethan's office, glass walls did what glass always does under pressure. They held and they revealed. Associates hovered in the doorway with sympathy rehearsed for the camera of one another's eyes. A partner said the word optics until it lost shape. Someone printed the photo and slid it across a conference table, as if paper could be asked to confess. The phone insisted itself into the day. The board wanted statements. The family attorneys wanted a timeline. The PR firm wanted to know whether the story contained any other small bombs. Every question was a hand reaching for control. Control at scale behaves like panic that went to finishing school. Ethan called Claire, voice steady the way rocks are steady right before they fall. He asked if she was all right. He asked if anyone had come to the school, if the parents were kind or curious or cruel. He said he'd handle it. He said it twice, as if a promise thickened with repetition. She told him she was fine in the way people are fine when they are trying not to complicate someone else's life. Children in her class had asked whether kindness could get you in trouble. She told them only when the world forgets its manners. At the mansion, the quiet was not quiet. It was the hum of generations adjusting their posture. Doors opened and closed without needing to. Footsteps traded urgency for poise when they turned corners. The staff spoke in respectful volumes that carried alarms in their pockets. In the study, Richard Harlan sat without moving for a long time, as if stillness could explain itself if given room. He held the newspaper the way you hold a letter written by a mistake you once believed in. He had known visibility would arrive eventually. It always does. Secrets are not vaults. They are bridges waiting for a footstep. What he had not calculated was how quickly a gesture becomes a thesis when witnessed by a lens. He remembered the bench. He remembered the wet. He remembered the simple gratitude that had walked across a paper bag and into his chest like a truth knocking politely. He also remembered fear. Small, shapeless, pushing from the past like a tide that never learned the word enough. The board reached him through the only channel power respects. Urgency disguised as duty. They said the word responsibility until it acquired the density of law. They reminded him that empires extend beyond one man's experiment with humility. They spoke of donors and unions and the delicate confidence of institutions that prefer their benefactors to be myth rather than man. He listened without defending himself. He had built these voices. He had summoned this world. It was right that it asked questions, even if it had forgotten how to ask the useful ones. By afternoon, the story had multiplied like reflections in a hall of mirrors. A blog published an old rumor that he'd once slept in his car. An op-ed scolded him for the sin of cosplaying need. Another called him proof that wealth wants absolution cheap. In a quieter corner of the internet, someone wrote about the way his hands looked in the photo, careful, grateful, not grabbing. The smallest details sometimes carry the most believable truths. Claire arrived at the mansion without a script. The gates opened for her the way certain doors open for sincerity, slowly, without interrogation. She carried no speech, only the kind of listening that makes a room remember its better self. A housekeeper led her to the back garden where the roses performed discipline and the gravel kept the sound of your steps honest. She found him there, sitting on a wrought iron bench that pretended not to be uncomfortable. He looked like a man measuring not the damage, but the cost of pretending there wasn't any. He greeted her with the same gentle clarity he'd offered on the sidewalk the first day, eyes first, then voice. He said he was sorry she'd been pulled into a storm he called his weather. She told him storms don't ask for maps. They did not talk about strategy. Strategy is what you feed fear to make it sit. They talked about memory. He told her about nights in his 20s when hunger was a companion that arrived on time. He told her about the cheap cafe that served dignity in a cup, about a janitor who loaned him a winter coat without asking for the date it would return. He told her he had promised himself, then, that wealth would never erase the address of the man who had needed help. He admitted that promises fade when surrounded by applause. Applause is a solvent, it makes edges soft. Inside, in the library that smelled of sapient wood, Ethan stood with his back to the door and his hands pressed against the spine of the desk. He practiced sentences that wanted to be both son and steward. When he turned and saw Claire, relief crossed his face first, then a shadow. He loved her, and he loved the thing that had raised him, order. Today love and order had arrived at odds. He asked his father to issue a denial. Not of the bench, not of the sandwich, but of the intention. He said the word misunderstanding and placed it between them like a shield. He suggested phrases that purchase time, context, nuance, evolving narrative. Words that perform decency while asking it to wait outside. Richard listened. He had taught this man how to tame rooms. He had also taught him that tamed rooms sometimes starve. He said there would be no denial. He said the photograph was accurate enough to be instructive. He said if people saw a performance, they were not entirely wrong. Every life is a stage. The trick is not to forget that breath is not a line delivered for an audience. A meeting assembled itself in the drawing room by evening. The family attorney, the PR director with immaculate diction, 2 board members whose faces knew the choreography of crisis. They admired Claire in the way powerful people admire virtues they cannot invoice. They tried to recruit her into the story's repair, to turn the teacher into a testimonial. She declined, gently, with the kind of grace that refuses to be drafted. She said kindness is not a press asset to be drafted. She said kindness is not a press asset. The sentence landed like furniture refusing to be rearranged. The attorney asked for control over the narrative. Control is a word that means reply on our terms. Richard said the narrative was the problem. He said he would speak plainly tomorrow at the foundation, with cameras if they insisted, without them if they could remember how to be human. The PR director blinked in slow disbelief. Plain speech is a risk rarely budgeted for. Night fell with the gravity of consequence. The mansion practiced sleep while nobody inside it mastered the lesson. In a guest room that had hosted ambassadors and ghosts, Claire sat by the window and wrote in a notebook she used for days when silence needed help finishing its thoughts. She wrote that wealth is loud until it remembers the first quiet it came from. She wrote that a photograph does not tell you who told the rain to keep going. She wrote that love must be brave when it is inconvenient, or it is only etiquette. Down the hall, Ethan called an old friend from the firm. He asked for advice that sounded different in his own ears than it had in others. He learned that fear makes even smart men repeat clichés until they feel useful. He hung up and stared at the ceiling, where chandeliers posed as constellations. It occurred to him that stars are dead for a long time before their light admits it. He wondered what part of him was already late to its own honesty. In the study, Richard opened a safe and took out a small black ledger that did not belong to the century of his net worth. The paper inside had learned to be patient. He turned to a page written years ago in a hand that had not yet been confident enough to dress itself in bold ink. It was a list of names. Not donors, not partners. People who had given him something when he had nothing to exchange but gratitude and the promise of trying to deserve it. A mechanic who shaved a bill, a nurse who looked the other way when he slept in a waiting room to escape the cold, a pastor who let him sit in the back with his head down and still counted him as present when counting was kindness. Head down and still counted him as present when counting was kindness. He had kept the ledger to remind himself that debt is not always a number. Sometimes it is a map. He placed the ledger on the desk where the morning would have to see it. He slept, eventually, with the open pages making a soft weather of their own. Morning made a theater of the foundation lobby. Cameras lined up like obedient teeth. Microphones became a small forest of questions waiting to be watered. Inside the auditorium, staff sat with hands folded and expressions rehearsed into neutrality. Board members positioned themselves with architectural intent. Sincerity entered anyway, uninvited but not easily dislodged. Richard walked to the podium without the armor of statements. He carried the ledger. And he carried the stillness of someone who has decided to let truth pay for what it breaks. He did not apologize for the bench. He apologized for forgetting how close benches are to altars when you have nowhere else to pray. He said he would not perform penance as publicity. He said he would expand the foundation's quiet work downtown and he would do it without press releases, which is to say, he would do it for the people who needed it rather than for those who needed to hear about it. He said the market could decide whether that made him unserious. He said the city could decide whether remembering poor days is a crime. He said his son had been raised on good linens and good intentions, and that both can suffocate if you never open a window. He read 5 names from the ledger. He told 5 small stories with the precision reserved for contracts, and the tenderness reserved for funerals. The room altered its temperature. Some people shifted toward him. Some shifted away. Clarity divides before it unites. Reporters asked if the photograph had been staged. He said rain does not take direction. They asked if the teacher was his fiancé's fiancé. He smiled at the inelegance of language under pressure. and said she was a person whose kindness made his house remember it was only a house. They asked if this person whose kindness made his house remember it was only a house. They asked if this was a pivot. He said it was a return. Afterward, in a corridor heavy with portraits of generosity that had learned to pose, Ethan stood facing his father. His voice, when it arrived, had put down its briefcase. He said he was afraid. He said he did not know how to manage a story that did not want to be managed. He said he wanted to protect the company, the staff, the people whose mortgages believed in the stock price. He said he wanted to protect the part of himself that still wanted to be the kind of son who impresses the world by disguising love as competence. Richard told him fear was information, not instruction. He said the company would survive truth better than it would survive a diet of careful lies. He said order is a beautiful room until it refuses to make space for a chair pulled up for someone who does not belong. He put a hand on his son's shoulder in a way that men forget they are allowed to. Something ancestral in the air adjusted its stance. The board voted that afternoon. Not on the man, this is not monarchy, but on a series of measures that sought to translate revelation into policy. They approved an initiative that redirected a portion of executive bonuses into a fund for the city's shelters and workforce training centers, with governance that hid no strings. They approved paid volunteer hours for staff, so generosity could try on a routine. They did not approve everything. Institutions confess in increments. But the shape of the future moved a little. In the evening, the mansion exhaled. The storm had not passed. Storms rarely pass. They thin and people choose whether to keep carrying umbrellas. Claire stood with Richard on the veranda, while the sky tried to remember a color that wasn't gray. He told her the ledger would be digitized, so that its gratitude could outlive his handwriting. He told her she had reintroduced him to himself. She told him he had made room for a city inside a policy. Both were true and neither was complete. Later, in the city inside a policy. Both were true and neither was complete. Later, in the small chapel on the estate grounds that had hosted more loneliness than weddings, Claire lit a candle for the woman in the photograph with wind in her hair. She did not pray for results. She prayed for durability, which is different. She asked for the kind of mercy that does not require an audience, and for love that can hold still when money insists on moving fast. That night, Ethan came to her without armor. He did not argue his father's case or the board's caution. He did not pitch her a future in bullet points. He sat on the floor beside the couch where she was reading, leaned his head against her knee, and breathed like someone who has just remembered how. He told her he had spent the day being important and had not once felt useful until this moment. He told her he wanted to learn how to choose the right embarrassment. He told her he loved her more for not volunteering his life to the camera. Outside, the city recovered its posture. Taxis learned new routes around the story. The bench downtown returned to anonymity, which is a kind of grace. Somewhere, a child asked a teacher if kindness still mattered when it got you in trouble. The teacher smiled and said trouble is sometimes the proof you are pointed in the right direction. In a drawer that did not lock, the ledger rested. Pages turned without hands in the small wind made by houses that finally remember they are only temporary shelters for whatever mercy can fit inside. Morning light entered the Harland estate like it had forgotten permission. It crept through the tall windows slowly, cautious, as if testing whether the house still remembered how to welcome something soft. The servants moved quieter than usual, as though the air itself might shatter. News vans had gone, reporters had found new stories to devour, but the echo of yesterday still clung to every corridor. Claire stood by the breakfast table, watching the steam rise from her tea. The china was thin enough to show light through it, like truth, beautiful only when it's fragile. Across from her sat Richard, silent, thoughtful. The newspaper lay folded neatly beside his plate. The front page bore his face again, but this time the headline was different. Billionaire speaks of hunger, humanity, and a city's forgotten heart. He hadn't read it yet. I thought I'd be angry, he said finally. But I'm not. Just tired. Claire smiled faintly. Tired is what honesty feels like after pretending for too long. He looked up, eyes kind. You speak like someone older than her years. Teaching will do that, she said. Children make you explain the world while you're still trying to understand it. He chuckled softly, the sound dry but genuine. And yet they listen better than shareholders. Outside, the gardens were waking, gardeners pruning rose bushes, sprinklers hissing like applause from the soil. Somewhere in the distance, Ethan's voice carried faintly, giving instructions to a contractor. He was overseeing the new expansion Richard had promised, a center built on the Harlan Foundation's land, meant to train and employ people without homes, without resumes, without proof. Richard had called it the bridge. Because, he'd said, kindness shouldn't stop at the handshake. But progress comes with its own friction. By afternoon, the board had convened again, not to resist this time, but to negotiate the terms of their surrender to conscience. Lawyers spoke in paragraphs. Accountants measured philanthropy in decimals. And through it all, Richard listened quietly, tracing the edge of a pen along the open ledger before him. He had brought it again, the small black book that now seemed to follow him like a pulse. Mr. Harland, one board member said, her voice courteous but clipped. The foundation's pivot has inspired goodwill, yes, but investors remain cautious. We've received letters questioning whether our leadership is stable. Richard looked up. Stable? Yes. They want to know if we're reacting emotionally instead of strategically. He smiled faintly. Perhaps we are. Emotion built this city before strategy sold it. The woman pressed her lips together, polite but unconvinced. And the press requests? You've refused interviews. I've spoken once, he said simply. That's enough. She frowned. But they'll fill the silence for you. Let them, he replied. Silence is just the world's test of patience. Claire, sitting quietly at the edge of the room, met his gaze. His words carried no bravado, only calm, the kind that comes when a man has already lost what mattered and learned to breathe anyway. When the meeting adjourned, Ethan lingered. You're not worried about reputation, he asked. Richard leaned back in his chair, a hint of weariness tugging at his shoulders. Reputation is only truth that's been groomed for photographs. I'm interested in legacy, and legacy is how strangers speak of you when your last name stops buying sentences. Ethan didn't answer. He wanted to, but he was still learning that silence too can be brave. That night, Claire walked through the mansion alone. She had stayed behind after dinner, the kind of quiet guest who becomes part of a house's memory. The halls seemed different now, less symmetrical, more human. She ran her hand along the polished banister, the cool wood smooth beneath her fingers. In the library, the fire was still lit. Richard sat in his armchair, an open book forgotten on his lap. He looked up when she entered. You can't sleep either, he asked. She shook her head. Too many thoughts. They all want to speak at once. He smiled gently. The price of a conscience. Is it worth it? She asked. He considered this. Every worthwhile thing costs peace for a while. Then it gives you back a different kind of peace, one that doesn't need applause. She sat across from him, painting amber across her face. You know, my students asked me something today. They wanted to know if you were in trouble. He raised an eyebrow. And what did you tell them? That sometimes trouble is what truth looks like in public. He laughed softly. Remind me never to debate your class. She hesitated, then said, You've changed, Mr. Harland. I mean, since that first day. He looked into the fire. Change is what happens when memory stops being polite. You think people can really change? He turned to her. I think people remember who they were before they learned to perform. That's not change. That's return. Weeks passed. The bridge began to rise from the ground, a humble structure of glass and brick, built not to impress but to endure. Workers from across the city came together, some with resumes, some with nothing but calloused hands and a name they hadn't spoken in pride for years. Richard visited the site often. He wore no suit there. Only a gray sweater and a cap that made him look like any man who'd come to watch something hopeful take shape. He'd stand by the edge of the lot, nodding to workers, sometimes helping to carry supplies. The foreman had once whispered to Claire, half in awe, You'd never know he owns half this skyline. She smiled. Maybe that's the point. But redemption is never a straight road. Curves through skepticism. Not everyone applauded. Some investors withdrew, citing philosophical differences. A gossip column called his philanthropy a public apology disguised as reform. Shareholders whispered about sentimentality. For every person who saw grace, two saw weakness. Richard didn't fight them. He simply continued. Every morning he was at the site. Every evening he'd return home exhausted, his cane tapping softly through the marble halls like a metronome counting sincerity. Ethan watched, torn between admiration and fear. To see his father humanized was to watch the myth crumble, but also to watch the man appear. One evening as the city's lights blinked awake, Ethan joined him at the site. "You know they'll never forgive you," he said quietly. Richard didn't look up from the plans. "Who?" "The ones who used to see you as untouchable." He smiled faintly. "Maybe being touchable is overdue." Ethan hesitated. "I used to think respect was earned by distance. That's what you taught me." "I was wrong," Richard said softly. "Respect is earned by proximity, by staying when others run." They stood in silence, the hum of machinery behind them. A gust of wind carried dust and the smell of concrete, the scent of beginnings disguised as endings. By late autumn the bridge was nearly finished. The day before its opening, Richard visited alone. The building glowed softly in the dusk, windows reflecting a sky learning to forgive itself. Inside, rooms waited, clean, simple, ready to hold stories that hadn't yet begun. He walked the halls slowly, his hand grazing the wall as if greeting an old friend. In the workshop, unfinished wooden tables stood like promises mid-sentence. On one of them lay a hammer, worn and familiar. He picked it up, weighing it carefully. It was the same model he'd used decades ago, when building wasn't a metaphor but survival. He smiled, remembering the rhythm of labor, the language of effort before wealth translated it. Behind him, Claire's voice broke the silence. "You built something that breathes." He turned, startled but pleased. "I hoped it would." She walked beside him, eyes shining. "You know, this place, it's not just a building. It's an apology turned into architecture." He nodded. "Then I finally said it right." When they stepped outside, the wind carried the smell of winter, sharp, new, alive. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the world had that prelude stillness, like it was listening. "Mr. Harland," Claire said softly, "if your wife were here, what would she think of all this?" He took a long breath. "She'd probably tell me it took me too long to remember how to be human. Then she'd kiss me anyway." Claire smiled. "Sounds like grace." He looked out toward the horizon. "Grace is what happens when you stop asking if you deserve it." They stood there a long time, saying nothing. The city hummed in the distance, alive, imperfect, forgiving in small doses. That night, back at the mansion, Richard wrote a letter. Not an email, not a memo, but ink on paper. His handwriting trembled, uneven but certain. "To those who come after me, remember that kindness is not a tax write-off, nor a headline. It is a currency that spends itself without permission, and somehow never runs out. Wealth should serve. If it rules, it rots. When the world forgets you, listen. That silence is your inheritance. Use it wisely." He folded the letter and placed it inside the ledger, the last entry. Then he closed the cover, exhaled deeply, and let the quiet settle. Outside, the first snow began to fall. Each flake landed softly, erasing edges, forgiving architecture, dusting over the footprints of power and pride. And inside the house that had once been a fortress, an old man finally felt small enough to belong again. Winter came like a quiet verdict. Not cruel, not gentle, just inevitable. The city wore frost the way old men wear medals, reminders of survival. By December, the bridge had opened. Its glass facade reflected the skyline, but inside, the air was different, lighter, warmer. People walked those halls who once slept under bridges that didn't have names. There were workshops, reading rooms, a cafe that served meals to anyone who came in, no questions asked. The press came once, then lost interest. The work continued without their applause. But not everyone was ready to forgive a man who had built empires on distance, and was now trying to rebuild on empathy. The backlash arrived the way winter storms do, first a whisper, then a wind. An investigative report appeared one morning, its tone surgical, its language polite enough to cut deeper. The headline read, "Philanthropy or Diversion? The Harland Foundation's Tax Maze." It was the kind of article written by people who have never met their subjects, yet claim to know the angles of their soul. It questioned the timing of the bridge's funding, implied mismanagement, hinted at impropriety that didn't exist but sounded too elegant to disprove. By noon, television panels had taken sides. By evening, investors were calling again, not to ask about truth but about optics. The story had legs, and the legs were running. Claire read it on her phone between classes. Her stomach turned as she scrolled. She'd seen the ledgers herself. Everything transparent, every dollar accounted for. But logic doesn't trend. Outrage does. When she arrived at the mansion that night, the gates were closed. Reporters stood outside, cameras waiting like hungry animals. Her name was already in a few of the headlines, the teacher at the center of the Harlan scandal. Ethan met her at the door. His tie was undone, his eyes restless. "It's bad," he said simply. "They're coming for him again." "Because he built something good?" she asked. "Because good isn't profitable unless they own it," he said bitterly. Inside, the air was heavy with the hum of phones, voices, strategy. The living room had become a war room. Advisors spoke in coded urgency, using words like containment and response narrative. Richard sat apart from them, silent in an armchair by the fire, looking at nothing in particular. When Claire entered, he looked up and smiled faintly, though his eyes carried fatigue. "You came through the noise," he said softly. "Where else would I go?" He gestured toward the television, where his own name scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Seems I'm news again. I should start charging for appearances." "Let them talk," she said. "The truth will last longer." He nodded. "It always does. But lies are louder." The conversation around them grew louder, plans, statements, projections. Someone mentioned freezing public funding until the audits cleared. Another whispered about a possible criminal inquiry, just for show. The noise became unbearable. Richard stood slowly, cane steady in his hand. "Enough," he said. The room went still. "Gentlemen," he continued, "you've all made very fine careers out of managing what can't be managed, perception. But this house has seen enough performance for one lifetime. Leave it. All of you." The silence that followed was thick. One by one they left, not out of respect but confusion. They didn't know how to advise a man who no longer needed permission to be decent. When the room emptied, Ethan spoke first. "Father, this could destroy everything. The company, the foundation." Richard turned toward him. "And if it does?" Ethan blinked. "You can't be serious." "I am. Maybe destruction is the last honest form of creation, Dad." "Ethan," he said softly, "you're afraid of losing a version of me that was never real. Let it go." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Claire crossed to Richard and sat beside him. "What will you do?" He smiled gently. "The same thing I did the first time I had nothing. Keep showing up." The next day, Richard went to the bridge. The media had already camped outside. The staff watched nervously as cameras pointed like weapons, waiting for confession. He didn't speak to them. He walked inside, hung his coat by the door, and joined a group sanding wooden tables in the main hall. No press, no statements. Just work. Some clip appeared online that night. Richard Harlan, billionaire, sleeves rolled up, helping a young man smooth the edges of a table. The caption read, "He builds bridges, not stories." It spread quietly at first, then faster. By the weekend, the tide had turned again. The same commentators who had questioned him now called him a symbol of modern humility. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Fickle worship," he muttered, when Claire showed him the new headlines. "They crucify, then canonize, then get bored." "Then why do you keep letting them?" she asked gently. "Because someone might notice between the noise," he said. "Someone who still believes kindness isn't a costume." But the real turning point didn't come through the media. It came through a letter. It arrived one cold morning, delivered by hand. The envelope was unmarked, the paper rough, the handwriting uneven. Richard opened it slowly, expecting another journalist's trap. Instead, he found 4 words written in pencil. "You kept your promise." Below the words was a small photograph, black and white, old, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. It showed a young man sitting on a curb, head bowed, coat too thin for the weather. Behind him, a wooden door with the words St. Francis Shelter painted above it. Richard's breath caught. He recognized it. He'd lived that photo. That door had once been his home. At the bottom, another line was scrawled. "You bought it back. We saw." He closed his eyes. When he'd bought that old building years ago, quietly, anonymously, he hadn't realized anyone was watching. He'd planned to restore it someday, but the world had gotten busy. Until now. He looked up at Claire. I think I just got forgiven. That afternoon he drove to the shelter site himself. No convoy, no cameras. The building stood half in ruin, half in memory. The paint was faded still there. He stepped out into the cold and ran his hand along the door frame. For a long moment he said nothing. Then softly he whispered, "I'm back." Claire, standing behind him, said nothing. She understood that sometimes prayer doesn't need witnesses. Inside, dust hung like light that forgot how to move. The smell of wood and old rain filled the air. Richard walked through the narrow hall, each step echoing with ghosts of laughter, hunger, and survival. He stopped at a cracked mirror nailed to the wall. The glass was warped, but his reflection looked clearer than it had in years. He smiled. "You're late," he told himself. That evening, he gathered Ethan and Claire in the study. "I'm buying it back," he said. Ethan frowned. "Buying what?" "The shelter. The one that saved me. I'm reopening it." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Father, you've already built the bridge. We're stretched thin. The market's still volatile. Maybe wait until..." "Wait until what?" Richard interrupted softly. "Until comfort grows back over my conscience?" Ethan looked away. "You don't owe anyone this." "I owe everyone this," Richard said. "Every man who sat on a cold step wondering if anyone would see him again. Every child who learned silence before safety. Every woman who gave me coffee when I couldn't pay. I owe them the rest of my time." The words landed with the quiet gravity of finality. Claire reached for his hand. "Then we'll help you." He looked at her. The woman who had handed him a sandwich without knowing she was feeding her own future. "You already did." Construction began within weeks. The old shelter transformed slowly, not erased but restored, as though it were remembering itself. Ethan helped this time, not out of obligation but out of something quieter, recognition. He stopped wearing suits to the site. He laughed more. The city began to change around them too, not dramatic. The air near the bridge was different. People lingered longer, smiled at strangers, carried coffee for others. Sometimes Claire taught evening classes there, language, budgeting, storytelling. Sometimes Richard just sat and listened to the noise of rebuilding, the most expensive sound he'd ever bought. And for the first time in decades he felt poor again, the good kind of poor, the kind that teaches gratitude. One night, long after the workers had gone, he walked through the nearly finished shelter alone. Snow had begun again, light as breath. The roof creaked softly under its weight. He paused by a window, looking out at the city glowing under frost. Claire found him there, a blanket over her shoulders. "You should rest," she said. "I am," he murmured. Standing up. He smiled. "You don't rest when you've just been forgiven. You stay awake long enough to mean it." She stepped closer. "You know this place isn't just a shelter anymore. It's a confession." He looked at her, eyes tired but clear. "Then it's the truest thing I've ever built." Outside, the snow thickened. The city grew quiet. The lights of the bridge glowed faintly in the distance, one structure born of mercy, the other of memory. Between them, the streets carried stories that finally belonged somewhere. And above it all, the night said nothing, because some truths, when finally spoken, no longer need to be repeated. Winter lingered longer than anyone expected. The snow fell late that year, then stayed, blanketing the world in a hush that made even the city cautious with its sound. For months the Harlan name lived quieter, no longer a headline, no longer a myth, just a name, human again. Claire and Ethan moved into a small brownstone near the bridge. The mansion still stood, but its walls had become too large for everyday life. They preferred windows that fogged in the morning, floors that creaked under real footsteps, and the kind of imperfection that didn't require polish to prove worth. Richard stayed in the old house, though now he opened the gates more often. The estate had turned into a place of gatherings, modest dinners with people who once would have never received an invitation. Artists, teachers, builders, even a bus driver or two. They came not for wealth but for warmth. Sometimes, Claire would find him sitting by the window, ledger open, pen hovering above a blank page. He didn't write as often now. Some days he just traced the names already written, whispering them like prayers to remind himself the world had once held him too. The shelter reopened in early spring. The city called it St. Francis House again, but people nicknamed it the first door. The name stuck because that's what it had always been, the first door someone opened when they wanted to walk back into life. Opening day wasn't flashy. No cameras, no ribbon cutting. Just people. Men and women who'd slept on benches the night before came in, drawn by the scent of soup and the promise of being seen. Volunteers from the bridge welcomed them with clean clothes and hot meals. Claire taught literacy in a back room. Ethan helped fix pipes in the kitchen. And Richard, the man who once sat outside this same building with nothing but a paper cup, greeted each person with the same quiet dignity they offered him in return. By evening, the building hummed with conversation, laughter, and the clatter of dishes, the language of hope in motion. A young man approached Richard timidly, holding a folded piece of paper. "Sir," he said, "I wanted to thank you for this place, for everything." Richard smiled. "Don't thank me, son. Thank the city for remembering you belong to it." The boy shook his head. "But I wouldn't be here if you hadn't built it." Richard looked around the room, at the volunteers, at Claire teaching in the corner, at Ethan handing out towels. "I didn't build it," he said softly. "I just started the remembering." Weeks passed, and the shelter and refuge became rhythm. People came in for warmth, left with jobs, friends, and a sense that maybe the world wasn't done with them yet. Richard came often, though each visit took a little more from him. The cane was heavier now, the walk slower. But his spirit, that stayed sharp. One evening, Claire found him sitting outside on the steps, coat draped over his shoulders, watching the sunset blur into amber and violet. "You should be inside," she said gently. "I like it here," he murmured. "You can hear the city breathing from these steps. It's a good sound." She sat beside him. "You've done more than anyone expected." He smiled faintly. "Expectations are prisons with good manners." They sat in silence for a while. Cars passed. The wind shifted. Somewhere down the street, a violinist played softly, notes rising into the cool air, fragile but sure. "You ever think about what comes next?" Claire asked. "I used to," he said. "Now I just think about what's left." She looked at him, sensing something beneath the calm. "You're not afraid, are you? Of dying?" He chuckled quietly. "No. I've already done that once, the day I stopped caring about people. This is just the other kind." Her throat tightened. "Don't talk like that." He turned to her, his eyes warm. "You gave me back my last chapter, Claire. Let me write it how I need to." That spring, the city finally began to bloom again. The harshness of winter melted into puddles that reflected new beginnings. Trees lining the bridge sprouted small leaves. Birds returned to the sky they'd abandoned months ago. Everything, even the skyline, seemed to breathe easier. Ethan and Claire married quietly with no photographers, no headlines. The ceremony took place in the bridge's courtyard, surrounded by people who'd built it. Richard walked Claire down the aisle himself. Every step was careful, but filled with pride that made the air tremble. He looked up at the sky and whispered something only the wind heard. Some said it sounded like a thank you. Others thought it was her name, the one he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Afterward, during the small celebration, he gave a toast that no one forgot. Some people spend their lives collecting fortunes. Others, their lives collecting faces, the ones they've helped, the ones who've helped them. If you're lucky, you learn that faces last longer. Claire's eyes filled. Ethan's hand tightened around hers. And for a fleeting moment, every person there, the workers, the students, the ones who'd once been homeless, felt like family. But time, as it always does, began to measure differently. By the next winter, Richard's health began to falter. The doctors used soft words: strain, fatigue, rest. He brushed them off politely, but the body keeps its own calendar. Claire visited often. Sometimes she'd find him asleep in the library, the fire burning low, the ledger resting on his lap. Sometimes he'd be awake, staring at nothing in particular, as if listening for something beyond hearing. One night, she found him sitting by the window again, watching snow fall across the garden. "You're still awake," she said. He smiled. "So is the world. I thought I'd keep it company." She sat beside him, resting her hand on his. "Do you regret any of it?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Regret is what cowards call memory when it hurts. I don't regret. I remember." He turned to her, voice low. "Promise me something. Anything. When the world forgets me again, as it should, don't let it forget why I was here." Her voice broke slightly. "I won't." He nodded once, satisfied. Good. Then I can rest. He passed quietly a few days later in his sleep. The nurse said he looked peaceful, as though he'd simply drifted into another kind of morning. On the nightstand beside him was the ledger. One last line written in a shaky hand. Kindness is what remains when everything else learns to leave. The city mourned him in its own imperfect way. The mansion gates filled with flowers. The bridge held a vigil, not of silence but of stories. People came to speak of small things. A handshake that led to a job, a coat given, a second chance offered without paperwork. No speeches, no cameras. Just memory shared like warmth. At the first door, someone hung his photograph by the entrance. Not a portrait, a candid shot, taken by a volunteer months earlier. It showed him laughing, sleeves rolled up, a streak of paint on his sweater. Beneath it, a plaque read simply, "He remembered." Weeks later, Claire returned to the mansion one last time. The staff had left. The house was mostly empty now. Dust motes drifted through sunlight like tiny souls unsure where to land. She walked through the halls, her footsteps echoing softly. In the study, the fire had long gone cold, but the air still carried his presence. On the desk sat the ledger, closed, waiting. She opened it carefully, fingers tracing the final page. Beneath his handwriting, she noticed a small envelope sealed with wax. Her name written on it. She opened it slowly. Inside, a single page. You once gave a stranger your lunch. You didn't know you were feeding a man's second life. Everything that came after, the bridge, the shelter, the laughter, began because you didn't walk past me. If you ever doubt the power of small things, remember me, sitting in the rain, and know that mercy moves mountains. Tears fell before she realized they had started. She folded the letter carefully, pressed it to her chest and whispered, "I'll remember." Outside, the snow began to melt again. The city, reborn once more, hummed with the sound of traffic and tenderness. And as Claire walked down the steps of the mansion, a familiar wind brushed against her face. Gentle, knowing, alive. Somewhere, it carried the faintest echo of a voice she once heard on a rainy morning. It's kindness. That's always enough. Years have a way of softening memory, sanding down its edges until even pain feels like a song half remembered. But some moments never lose their outline. For Claire, that rainy morning at the bus stop remained untouched by time, as vivid as if it were still happening. The cold, the weight of the sandwich in her hand, the look in his eyes before he spoke the words that would outlive him. 3 years had passed since Richard's death. The city had moved on, as cities always do, but not entirely. Some things he left behind had taken root too deeply to be erased. The bridge had grown, not taller but wider. What began as one building had become a small network of centers across the city. They were no longer called foundations or initiatives. People just called them places you could start again. The name was enough. Ethan ran them now, though he refused titles. Director felt too formal, CO too hollow. He preferred to be known by his first name, a quiet act of rebellion against the weight of legacy. And Claire, she still taught. Some days in classrooms, some days in shelters, sometimes in the open air with folding chairs and notebooks that flapped in the wind. She said learning shouldn't live only in walls. The students, some children, some adults, adored her. They called her Miss Claire, even when she told them not to. Their home, the little brownstone near the bridge, had become a haven of its own. On any given day, someone might knock, a former student, a worker from the shelter, a neighbor in need of a warm drink and kinder eyes. No one ever left hungry. That she'd promised herself. But even peace, when lived honestly, carries echoes. It started one cold November morning. Gray sky, thin light, the kind that makes even hope wear a coat. A man stood outside the bridge, hesitant, watching through the window. His clothes were worn, but his gaze was alert, curious, as though he wasn't quite sure if he belonged. Claire, leaving after her morning class, noticed him. Something in his stance, the way he lingered just outside the threshold, stirred something familiar in her chest. She smiled. "You can come in, you know. It's warmer inside." He hesitated. "Didn't want to bother anyone." "You're not bothering. You're being brave. That's different." He met her eyes, then nodded slightly and stepped inside. The smell of coffee and bread greeted him, along with the low hum of conversation. Volunteers moved between tables, laughter soft and unguarded. The man looked around slowly, taking it all in, the warmth, the walls covered in photos, the air of welcome. Claire poured him a cup of coffee. "What's your name?" "David," he said, voice low but steady. "Well, David," she said, sliding the cup toward him. "You're home now." He smiled faintly, wrapping his hands around the cup. "This place. It's something else." "It's a memory made solid," she said. "Someone built it because he once needed it too." "Who?" She glanced toward the large photo by the entrance. Richard, still smiling, paint on his sweater. A man who believed kindness could outlive him. David followed her gaze. "I read about him," he said softly. "Didn't think any of it was real." "Oh, it's real," she said. "Every table, every chair, every second chance here, real as your next breath." He looked at her again. "You knew him?" She nodded. "Once. Long enough to learn what grace looks like when it finally stops running." Over the weeks that followed, David became part of the rhythm. He started helping with small repairs, then the evening meal service. He had a talent for fixing things. Old furniture, broken locks, leaky faucets. He worked quietly, head down, the kind of man who didn't ask for recognition. One afternoon, she leaned against the doorframe and watched. "You've been busy." He smiled. "Feels good to be needed again." She nodded. Funny how purpose fixes more than hands ever could. He looked up. "You really believe all this makes a difference?" She walked over, crouched beside him, eyes steady. "I watched one sandwich change the world, David. So yes, I believe." That winter, the bridge held its annual gathering. Not a gala, Richard had outlawed those. Just an open night where anyone could come share stories. Former residents, teachers, workers, and strangers filled the hall, their laughter mixing with the smell of stew and cinnamon. Ethan took the stage briefly to welcome everyone. His voice steady but soft. "My father once said legacy is measured by strangers who remember your kindness. Look around. You're his legacy." Applause followed, long and honest. Afterward, Claire stood by the doorway watching as people hugged, wept, laughed, forgave. She turned toward the empty space near the entrance where Richard used to stand. For a moment, she almost saw him there again, leaning on his cane, smiling quietly at the crowd. Then she heard his voice again, faint in her memory. Kindness never loses its way. And for the first time she understood. He hadn't been talking about himself. He'd been talking about her. Spring came again. The city thawed. The world turned green. Claire continued teaching, but her lessons had changed. They were less about grammar, more about grace. Less about facts, more about forgiveness. One day a student asked, "Miss Claire, how do you know if you've done something that matters?" She smiled. "If it scares you and heals someone at the same time, it matters." The class wrote that on the board and left it there for weeks. One afternoon, Ethan came home early. He'd been quiet lately, thoughtful in the way people are when purpose begins to shift beneath their feet. He set a folder on the table and poured himself tea. "What's that?" Claire asked. He handed it to her. "An expansion proposal. We've been offered land in 4 other cities. They want the bridge everywhere." She opened it, scanning the pages. "That's incredible." "It is," he said slowly. "But I'm not sure if it's right." She looked up. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because sometimes when things get too big, they forget why they started. My father's dream wasn't to scale compassion. It was to protect it." Claire nodded, understanding. "Then keep it small enough to stay human." He smiled. "That's why I married you." She laughed softly. "No, you married me because I make better coffee." "Also true," he said. They sat together in the fading afternoon light, quiet and content. Outside, the sound of the city drifted in, car horns, laughter, footsteps, all blending into a kind of music. Later that evening, they walked to the first door. The sun had already set, and the lights along the street glowed golden against the dark. They passed people heading home, couples walking dogs, street vendors closing shop. Ordinary life, perfectly imperfect. When they reached the shelter, they found a small crowd gathered at the steps. David stood at the center holding a notebook. He turned when he saw them. "I've been writing something," he said shyly. "For him. For Mr. Harland. Can we hear it?" Claire asked. He nodded, opening the notebook. His voice trembled at first, then found its rhythm. A poem, simple and unpolished but honest. He sat where the world forgot to look, and saw the rest of us anyway. He built bridges not to cross, but to remind us that love still knows the way. He gave us doors, not to enter wealth, but to leave loneliness behind. And now we carry his light, in paper cups, in sandwiches, in the small brave things we give away. When he finished, silence filled the air. Someone began to clap. Then everyone did. It wasn't loud, just long, the kind of applause that means thank you more than it means bravo. Claire wiped her eyes. Ethan put an arm around her shoulders. He'd have loved that, she whispered. He'd have told him to publish it, Ethan said with a grin. They stood there as the crowd dispersed, the last of the evening light fading behind them. That night, Claire wrote a letter, not to anyone living, but to the man who started it all. You were right, Richard. Kindness doesn't lose its way. It just changes hands. Sometimes it's a sandwich. Sometimes it's a shelter. Sometimes it's a word said softly when the world shouts too loud. And sometimes it's the courage to keep believing people are worth saving, even when they forget themselves. I see you in every thank you whispered at the bridge, in every smile that walks out of the first door. You didn't just change lives. You reminded us we could. She folded the letter and placed it inside his ledger, which now rested in the office at the bridge. The ink had faded on some names, but their stories hadn't. Months later, during a warm summer evening, Claire took her students to the bridge's rooftop garden, something Richard had insisted on building before he died. Let them see the sky, he'd said. People heal faster when they remember they're part of something bigger. The garden was alive with color. Tomatoes, basil, sunflowers, all tended by the same hands that once shook from cold. The air smelled of earth and effort. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Claire stood at the edge watching the city glow. Beside her, a little girl tugged on her sleeve. Miss Claire, she said, is it true this all started with a sandwich? Claire smiled. It is. That's silly, the girl said. How can something big start with something small? Claire crouched down, meeting her eyes. Because big things never start big, sweetheart. Big, sweetheart. They start exactly the size of your heart. The girl thought about that, nodded solemnly, and ran off to water the flowers. Claire looked back at the city, the lights, the noise, the life, and whispered to the wind, still moving, Richard. Just like you said. Summer had arrived with the confidence of something earned. The city was loud again. Markets awake, children chasing each other through hydrant mist, music spilling from street corners. Yet somewhere beneath the noise a new rhythm lived, quieter but stronger, the rhythm of people remembering. Claire felt it every time she walked through the bridge. The halls buzzed with stories now. You could hear laughter where silence once lived, see confidence where shame had taken root. The walls carried murals painted by those who used to avoid mirrors, hands that once shook now steady enough to draw sunlight. But success has its shadows. Every miracle invites examination. Every movement calls forth its skeptics. It began with letters, at first, polite inquiries from journalists wanting to understand how kindness scaled. Then came opinion pieces, thinly veiled suspicion dressed as curiosity, the Harland legacy, idealism, or image? Claire ignored them at first. She'd seen how quickly the world turns compassion into controversy. But Ethan watched closely, jaw tightening as more articles appeared. One evening he came home late, exhaustion written in his shoulders. He set a folder on the kitchen table, another set of headlines. They're starting to dig again, he said quietly. Claire poured him tea. Let them dig. All they'll find is good. Maybe. But I've learned the truth doesn't sell until it bleeds. She met his eyes. Then we'll bleed with grace. He smiled faintly. You sound like him. I try. A few weeks later, Claire received a letter from a woman in another city, a small town 2 states away. Writing was careful, the ink smudged in places. Dear Mrs. Harland, my name is Rosa. I run a soup kitchen here in Tallridge. We read about the bridge. Your story made its way to us, through someone who said they'd once eaten there. We don't have much, but we have heart. We'd like to build something similar. We just don't know where to start. Can you help? Claire smiled as she read it. The words carried a trembling hope, the kind that dares to ask for help without expecting an answer. She folded the letter and showed it to Ethan that evening. He read it silently, then said, if we help them, there'll be more. Dozens of towns like this. Hundreds. Good, she said simply. He looked at her, recognizing that calm, the same certainty his father once carried. "You're going to do it, aren't you?" "Yes," she said. "Because he didn't build the bridge to stop here. He built it so others could find theirs." That fall, Claire and Ethan took a train to Tallridge. The town was small, quiet, tucked between hills and old highways. It had one main street, one church, one diner. People there didn't know the Harlan name beyond faint headlines. Rosa met them at the station, a woman in her 50s with a face that had seen both hardship and laughter. "Didn't think you'd actually come," she said, hugging Claire tightly. "We've had a few dreamers come through before. Never thought one would stay." Claire smiled. Dreamers are just builders without blueprints. Over the next few days they toured an abandoned post office. Cracked windows, peeling paint, but solid bones. "This could be it," Rosa said. "If only we could afford to fix it." Ethan ran his hand along a beam, feeling its strength. "It'll hold," he said. "You just need to give it purpose again." They stayed for 2 weeks. No press, no entourage. They helped clean debris, paint walls, rebuild windows. The town noticed, not because of who they were, but because of what they did. For hours of work, Rosa handed them a folded note. "From one of the local kids," she said. He didn't sign it. Inside, in uneven handwriting, "My mom says you're rich, but you still get dirty. I like that. I want to be like that when I grow up." Claire's eyes stung. She folded the note and placed it in her pocket. "That's why we came," she whispered. By the time winter arrived, the post office had become the second bridge. It wasn't fancy, mismatched chairs, donated stoves, walls still rough around the edges, but it felt alive. The first night it opened, a dozen people came. By the end of the week there were 50. Rosa ran it with quiet pride. "You've given this town its heart back," she told Claire. "No," Claire said. "You just remembered where you left it." Word spread again, not through media this time but through people. Letters began arriving from small towns across the country. Bakers, teachers, retired nurses, factory workers, all wanting to build something, anything that made kindness visible again. Claire read them all. Some were simple, others heartbreaking. All sincere. And slowly the bridge became more than a name. It became a language. 1 year later, they gathered at the first door for an anniversary dinner. The tables were filled with faces from every version of the story, workers, teachers, volunteers, and strangers who'd once only had each other. Ethan stood to speak. His voice carried the calm confidence his father once had. "When my father died, he left behind 2 things, a ledger and a lesson. The ledger held names. The lesson held grace. We can't build enough shelters for the world, but we can build enough hearts to keep trying." He looked at Claire, eyes soft. "And we can start with one." The crowd applauded quietly. Afterward, Claire stepped outside. Snow had begun to fall again, the same way it always did, soft, slow, like forgiveness that forgot to hurry. She stood there, watching the lights blur in the cold, and thought about how much had changed and how little. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Beautiful night." She turned. David stood behind her, hands in his pockets, smiling. "It is," she said. "You staying for the after-dinner gathering?" "Wouldn't miss it. I'm reading another poem." "Oh," she asked, amused. "About who?" He smiled. "About you." Inside, candles flickered on the tables. People gathered close, warm breath rising in clouds of laughter. David stood at the front, notebook in hand. He cleared his throat. "This one's called The Woman with the Sandwich." Laughter rippled softly through the crowd. Then he began. She didn't know the storm she fed, nor the world her small act would mend. She saw hunger and offered a meal, but what she really gave was permission to feel. A man became a bridge that day, from loneliness to grace. And though he's gone, his kindness stays, in every tear that love replaces. She thought it ended with a bite, but mercy travels past the night. It builds, it blooms, it carries still. A single sandwich, a city's will. When he finished, no one moved. Then, as if by instinct, they all rose, not in applause but in silent standing respect. The kind given not to performance but to truth. Claire wiped a tear, heart swelling with something beyond pride. It was gratitude, vast, quiet, complete. Later that night, she returned home and sat by the window, the same way Richard once had. The street below glowed gold from lamplight, snow piling gently on parked cars. She opened the ledger, now kept at home, worn from years of handling, and traced her fingers along his handwriting. She turned to a blank page and wrote, "The bridges keep growing. They are not mine. They belong to everyone who believes a small act can rewrite the world." She closed the book, palm against the cover as if sealing a promise. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window slightly, and for a moment she imagined she heard his voice again, quiet, kind, amused. "Still moving, I see." She smiled. "Always." Spring returned. Flowers climbed fences. Laughter filled streets again. The bridge expanded quietly across towns and cities, not as an organization, but as a movement. Some were called the bridge, others the door, the table, the first kindness. Names didn't matter. What mattered was the echo, the whisper passed between strangers that said, "We remember." One afternoon, a journalist, young, eager, skeptical, came to interview Claire. He carried a camera and the confident smile of someone who believed in questions more than answers. "Mrs. Harland," he began, "how does it feel to have changed so many lives?" Claire laughed softly. "I didn't." He frowned. "But you and your husband." "We didn't change lives," she interrupted gently. "We reminded people they could change their own." He hesitated. "And what would you say started all of this?" "The shelters, the movement." She smiled, looking past him out the window where children played in the sunlight. "A mistake, I suppose. I was late to a meeting once. Decided to stop for someone hungrier than me." The journalist blinked. "That's it. That's everything," she said. He didn't understand yet, but someday he might. That night, Claire visited the bridge alone. The halls were quiet, the lights dimmed. She walked to the wall where Richard's photo hung, surrounded by hundreds of small cards, notes left by visitors. Some thanked him, some told stories, some just said, "I'm trying." She touched the frame lightly. "You did it," she whispered. "It's still moving." Then she turned off the lights and stepped outside. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of rain, familiar, almost nostalgic. Her face softly, and for a moment she closed her eyes. And in that quiet she heard it again. His voice, gentle and certain, carried through the years like a hymn. Kindness never loses its way. The years passed the way autumn leaves do, one quiet letting go at a time. The world grew busier again, noisier, brighter. Yet beneath the static hum of progress, something softer endured. A quiet current that refused to die out. It didn't have a name anymore. No logos, no headlines. Just people doing small things for other people across cities, oceans, languages. A cup of coffee left on a step. A blanket offered on a cold night. A stranger's bill paid without explanation. If you followed those gestures long enough, they led back to a rainy morning, a paper bag, and 2 words spoken by a man who'd once forgotten how to be seen. It's kindness. Claire was older now. Her hair had silver in it, though her laughter hadn't aged a day. The little brownstone was still home, its walls lined with photographs, hand-drawn thank you notes, and the same wooden table where she and Ethan used to plan dreams that felt too big to fit in one lifetime. Ethan still ran the bridge. He moved slower these days, not from weariness but reverence, for the work, for the people, for the city that kept teaching him patience. Their son, Gabriel, now in his 20s, had taken up teaching. He was gentle like his mother, quiet like his grandfather, and curious like both. Every Sunday, the 3 of them would visit the first door. It was tradition, no matter the weather, no matter how busy life became. The staff knew to expect them. They'd share lunch, read stories, help fold laundry or sweep floors. And always, before leaving, Claire would stop by the photo on the wall, the one of Richard, smiling beneath the weight of paint and purpose. She'd rest her hand on the frame and whisper, "Still moving." The staff didn't ask what she meant. They didn't need to. They felt it every day. That winter, a young girl named Lila began coming to the bridge. She was 16, quiet, with sharp eyes and a notebook she never let go of. She'd lost her mother months before, and had been drifting between shelters. Claire noticed her on her 3rd visit, sitting by the window, sketching faces of strangers who walked past. "You draw beautifully," Claire said, sitting beside her. Lila shrugged. "It's easier than talking." "That's all right," Claire said gently. "Some people heal in words. Some in lines." Over time, Lila began helping with murals, painting walls with colors the building hadn't known before, skies where ceilings used to be, rivers flowing through hallways. Her art turned the place into memory made visible. One day she showed Claire a sketch, a portrait of a man on a bench, coat frayed, eyes kind. "I found his picture on the wall," Lila said softly. "He looks like he'd listen." Claire's breath caught. "He did," she said. "More than anyone." "Who was he?" "Someone who remembered." Months later, during the Bridge's annual Remembrance Day, Lila unveiled her mural, a vast painting that stretched across the courtyard wall. It showed a man sitting beneath a tree, offering half his sandwich to a stranger. The city skyline rose behind them, but the focus was small, their hands reaching, meeting halfway. At the bottom, in bold, hand-painted words, "Kindness never loses its way." When Claire saw it, she cried. Not the kind of tears that ache, but the kind that free something that's been waiting too long. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "He'd love this," he whispered. "He does," she said. "He's right here." The crowd gathered, clapping softly. Children pointed at the mural, tracing the figures. Some recognized the story. Most didn't. It didn't matter. The message was clear in any language. Later, when everyone had gone, Claire stayed behind, the mural glowing faintly under the soft lights. She stood there for a long while, lost in thought. Then, almost as if carried by instinct, she pulled from her coat pocket the small note she'd kept for decades, folded so many times it felt thin as breath. The one she'd found in the paper bag that first day. "Never underestimate the worth of what you give away." She smiled through tears. "You were right," she whispered. "You always were." The next morning, Gabriel found her sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea, notebook open. "Writing again?" he asked. "Trying," she said with a grin. "Your grandfather started something I can't seem to finish." "What's it about?" "Kindness," she said simply. "Not as a story. As a map." He nodded thoughtfully. "You think the world still listens?" She looked out the window where sunlight painted the street gold. "Only when it's quiet enough." That spring, Gabriel began organizing small bridge circles, informal gatherings where people met once a month to share stories of ordinary good. It started with a dozen attendees. Within a year, there were hundreds scattered across cities and towns. No branding, no sponsors, just stories, one kindness at a time. At the first gathering, he read aloud from his grandfather's ledger, his voice steady but reverent. "Wealth should serve. If it rules, it rots." People nodded, some cried, others just listened. A woman raised her hand. "How do we know what to do?" she asked. Gabriel smiled. "Start small. Then don't stop." Claire watched the movement grow from afar. She didn't need to lead it anymore. It had its own momentum now, carried by strangers she'd never meet, people who'd never know her name but lived by the echoes of her choices. Sometimes, when walking home at dusk, she'd see glimpses. A boy sharing his umbrella with an old man, a woman leaving food on a doorstep, a teenager pausing to help someone pick up ordinary moments, sacred in their smallness. And every time she'd feel the same quiet certainty, it's still moving. Years later, when she was old and gray, Claire sat in her favorite chair by the window, the same one Richard used to favor. Her hands had grown frail, but her eyes still carried the same light. Gabriel visited often, bringing tea and news from the circles. One evening he told her, "They've started one in Seoul, another in Nairobi, and a new shelter opened in Rio. They named it the Third Door." Claire chuckled softly. "It's everywhere now." He nodded. "It's bigger than any of us." She looked out the window at the glowing city. That's what he wanted. Not to be remembered, but to be repeated. Gabriel smiled. And he is. That night, after Gabriel left, Claire opened her old notebook one last time. She turned to the final page, the one she'd been saving for years. Her handwriting trembled, but her words didn't. Kindness doesn't die. It changes form, from hands to hearts, from strangers to stories, from small acts to legacies. One day, someone else will hand a sandwich to someone forgotten, and they'll never know the world began again in that moment. But it will. It always does. She closed the notebook, setting it beside the window where moonlight touched the cover. Outside, the city pulsed softly, alive with its usual noise, its endless motion. But beneath it, faint, constant, was another rhythm, the one that never stopped moving. The rhythm of kindness. And somewhere, in a part of the night where memory and mercy meet, An old voice whispered again, carried by wind, by laughter, by time itself. It's kindness. That's always enough. The years had washed away faces, seasons, and names, but not the rain. It still fell on the same city where one woman once stopped to share her lunch with a stranger. And somewhere beneath that same gray sky, out with something small, a sandwich, a smile, a moment of mercy. The cycle began again. Quietly. Invisibly. Because kindness never needed witnesses. It just needed to keep moving.